Hi, good afternoon. My name is Dr. Liu. So I'm going to present my paper on corporate governance practice intention among Malaysian small and medium-sized enterprises. So this paper is co-authored by Ms. Lim Shu Yi from the Faculty of Business and Management, UCSI University, myself, and Professor Abu Bakar Sadr from Putra Business School, University Putra, Malaysia. So as an introduction, since this research is about small and medium-sized enterprise or SMEs, SMEs are vital for inclusive growth and globalization achievement. And they are also the main contributors and generators of economic activity in this country as well. And they represent the majority of enterprises around the world. So in Malaysia, SMEs represent 98.5% or 907,065 of total business establishments in 2015. It employs 66% of the total Malaysian workforce in 2017 and contributed to 38.3% of the Malaysian gross domestic product or GDP in 2018. Researchers have found, researchers from international finance corporations have found that poor management due to weak governance is the main contributor to the high failure rate among SMEs around the world. So despite the benefits of corporate governance and the encouragement by regulators, for them to adopt it, the actual level of sound practice and general awareness of CG is still very low. Particularly in Malaysia. And this is possibly due to the absence of the mandatory requirements for SMEs to comply with CG in Malaysia based upon the regulations. So considering the significance of the need for SMEs to practice good corporate governance and the low level of awareness and actual practice, this study investigates the behavioral aspects affecting the adoption of CG among Malaysian SMEs. So this study utilized theoretical models, that is theory of planned behavior, the decomposed theory of planned behavior, and the technology, organizational, environmental framework. So despite the growing interest in corporate governance around the world, there are very few studies on CG among SMEs. And the CG literature on Malaysian SMEs is very limited. And this study contributes to the existing literature on SME governance by filling in the gap in the current literature. And although there are existing CG research on Malaysian SMEs, as far as it is concerned, there are no behavioral studies within the context of individuals inside organizations that have been done. So within the best of our knowledge, this is the first such study on Malaysian SMEs. And this study integrates the decomposed theory of planned behavior with the technological organizational environment framework in order to analyze the behavioral intention to adopt CG practices from the perspective of individuals inside organizations. And these individuals are basically managers. So this is the theoretical framework of our research. Okay, so we'll be using structural equation modeling to analyze all these constructs. And of course, the n-dependent variable will be the intention to practice CG, and all these are the independent variables. So this is our hypothesis development. The first is the antecedents of intention to practice CG. The first construct is attitude. The attitude is defined as the evaluation of the behavior of interest. And previous studies have found that enterprises are more willing to adopt certain practices if they believe that such behavior will have positive outcomes. So in this study, it is defined as an evaluation of the SME's interest in practicing corporate governance. And in the context of this study, if the manager perceived the outcome of the CG practice to be beneficial, it will be judged as favorable and the intention will be higher. So this is the our line of argument. So when the managers develop a favorable attitude towards CG, they may be interested to practice CG in their businesses. So our first hypothesis, attitude positively influences the intention to practice CG among Malaysian SMEs. Our second hypothesis, basically, we are analyzing the subjective norms. Subjective norms is defined as perceived expectations from key references to perform the behavior of interest. So in this study is defined as the perceived expectations of SMEs to practice CG from key references. And these key references group are basically those parties who are influential to the SMEs. So in this study, the intention of SME managers to adopt CG practices can actually be influenced by the opinions from those people who are important to the managers inside organizations. So the stronger the opinion, the stronger is the behavioral intention, and vice versa. So our second hypothesis, subjective norms influences the intention to practice CG among Malaysian SMEs. Our third hypothesis is perceived behavioral control. So this perceived behavioral control is defined as the perception of existing resources and opportunities to perform particular behaviors. So in the context of this study, it is defined as the perception of SMEs' existing resources and opportunities to practice CG. And previous studies have proved that perceived behavioral control influences behavioral intentions. So when managers perceive that they have faith to implement CG practices and perceive that the organization have sufficient resources for this purpose, their intention to practice CG will be much higher. So our third hypothesis, perceived behavioral control, positively influences the intention to practice CG among Malaysian SMEs. Our fourth hypothesis is basically we're dealing with antecedents of attitude to practice CG, and this is we're analyzing perceived relative advantage. Now, perceived relative advantage is defined as the degree to which an innovation provides benefits. So in the context of this study, it's defined as the perceived benefits of CG by SMEs if CG is practiced. And according to the decomposed theory of planned behavior, it argues that the greater the advantages being perceived, the more favorable will be the attitude to engage in certain behavior. So in this study, if Malaysian SMEs perceive CG as being beneficial, their attitude towards CG will be favorable. So our fourth hypothesis, perceived relative advantage towards CG positively influences the attitude to practice CG among Malaysian SMEs. Our fifth hypothesis is also deals with antecedents of attitude, and we're analyzing perceived complexity. Perceived complexity is defined by Rogers as the degrees to which an innovation is perceived to be difficult to understand, learn, or operate. So in this study, it is defined as the degree to which CG is perceived to be difficult to understand, learn, and practice. And Taylor and Todd argued that when the level of complexity is reduced, the attitude will be more favorable. In the context of this study, the attitude of SME managers towards CG will be more favorable if the level of complexity is reduced. So our fifth hypothesis, perceived compatibility of CG positively influences the attitude to practice CG among Malaysian SMEs. Hypothesis number 6, we are analyzing antecedents as well, and we're analyzing perceived compatibility. So perceived compatibility relates to the extent of believing the system is consistent with the existing values, previous experiences, and current needs. So in the context of this study, it is explained as the extent to which the SMEs perceive CG as consistent with the existing values, previous experiences, and current needs of the organization. And previous researchers have found that when a subject matter is in line with the existing values, needs, and experience, the attitude will be favorable. So our hypothesis number 6, perceived compatibility of CG positively influences the attitude to practice CG among Malaysian SMEs. Hypothesis number 7, so now we're analyzing the antecedents of subjective norms to practice CG, and we're analyzing internal and external stakeholders. Now, in the context of this study, subjective norms can be decomposed into internal and external stakeholders, as they are the major parties which can affect organizational adoption decisions. The internal stakeholders are those responsible for the internal change, while the external stakeholders are those responsible for the external change. The previous studies have found that there is a significant positive relationship between decomposed subjective norms and subjective norms. And both the internal and external stakeholders can actually affect Malaysian SMEs in deciding to practice CG. So this is our line of argument. So our hypothesis number 7, H2A and H2B. So H2A, internal stakeholders positively influences the subjective norm to practice CG among Malaysian SMEs. H2B, external stakeholders positively influences the subjective norm to practice CG among Malaysian SMEs. Hypothesis number 8, we are analyzing antecedents of perceived behavioral control to practice CG. And we're analyzing here now the constructs of self-efficacy, organizational readiness, and external support. So perceived behavioral control to practice CG can be divided into 3 components. That is self-efficacy, organizational readiness, and external support. Self-efficacy is defined as the belief in the capabilities to execute the course of action required to perform behaviors. In the context of this study, the SMEs' belief towards their capabilities to practice CG is analyzed. Organizational readiness is defined as managers' perception and evaluation to which they believe the organization has the availability of the resources to adopt. So in this study, it relates to the SME's managers' perception and evaluation to which they believed the organization has the resources to practice CG. And external support is defined as the level of support provided by external mediating entities such as government, consultants, and vendors. So in this study, it is defined as the level of support that external parties provide to the SMEs in practicing CG. So our hypothesis number 8, H3A, 3B, and 3C. H3A, self-efficacy positively influences the perceived behavioral control to practice CG among Malaysian SMEs. H3B, organizational readiness positively influences the perceived behavioral control to practice CG among Malaysian SMEs. And H3C, external support positively influences the perceived behavioral control to practice CG among Malaysian SMEs. The next is the research methodology. So the population of our study is Malaysian SMEs. The sample source is from the SME directory published on the website of the SME Corporation Malaysia. The sampling method used is the random sampling. Sample target, we target respondents who are the managers of selected SMEs who possess the relevant knowledge to run the operation of their businesses, as well as being the key decision makers of the firm. The sample size is 262 SMEs. The data collection method is through survey questionnaire, and the data analysis method is based upon we use the structural equation modeling using PLS SEM software. So discussion of the research results, hypothesis 1A is supported. The perceived relative advantage is a significant and positive predictor of the attitude towards CG practice among Malaysian SMEs. Hypothesis 1B is not supported. Perceived complexity is insignificant to the attitude towards CG practice among Malaysian SMEs. Hypothesis 1C is supported. Perceived compatibility is proven to have a significant and positive relationship with the attitude towards CG practice among Malaysian SMEs. Hypothesis 2A and 2B are supported. Both the stakeholders, is positively influence the CG practices. Okay, and hypothesis 3A is supported as well. Self-efficacy is proven to be a significant determinant of the perceived behavioral control to practice CG among Malaysian SMEs. The same for hypothesis 3B. Organizational readiness is proven to be significantly and positively related to the perceived behavioral control to practice CG among Malaysian SMEs, and hypothesis 3C is supported as well. The external support is proven to be significantly and positively related to the perceived behavioral control to practice CG among Malaysian SMEs. Okay, so these are the results, and as a conclusion, this study provides evidence of the behavioral aspects of Malaysian SMEs towards practicing CG in terms of policy implications, This study can significantly guide practitioners and policymakers in developing strategies to promote CG for SMEs and in designing CG for SMEs in the country. In terms of the limitations, this study is confined to Malaysian SMEs only. This study also used a cross-sectional analysis in the implementation of the research. Therefore, it's difficult to determine the time sequence of the relationship between the constructs. Individuals' perception may change over time, and future studies can be conducted based upon longitudinal research design. It can also include national culture to conduct a comparison in a cross-country study. Furthermore, the effects of demographic variables such as gender and age were also not explored in this study. This requires future investigation. And these are the references. So thank you very much for listening to my presentation. Goodbye.